today's session is on active learning for children with visual and multiple impairments, including deaf blindness. And I need to minimize this real quick. This is 6th in our series that Julie Freed's doing for Grantwood AEA, through Grantwood AEA. And let me make sure I can get this thing to go forward here. There we go. Okay. So today for our objections, first thing we're going to talk about kind of briefly is connections to the DLM and that expanded taxonomy. And then we're going to discuss what active learning is. Then I'm going to move through some of the instructional environments and examples of active learning environments. Then we're going to talk a little bit about phases of development, data collection, some instructional considerations, some resources, and then I have a quick couple of closing statements about active learning. So, as some of you have probably seen, that DLM's expanded taxonomy of cognitive processes looks like this, and what the children that this presentation is going to focus on is that most of the series of presentations is going to focus on is going to be those kids at the pre-intentional attending and responding levels. So, you know, at that pre-intentional level, their behavior reflects a state, but does not necessarily reflect intentional behavior. Intent is often inferred by other people. At that attends level, we're going to talk a lot about this level today. They'll orient to objects. We're going to talk mostly about objects today. In routines, we talked more about people and activities in the session on routines. Today, it's going to be a lot on orienting to objects. And then that next level is that responding level, intentional response using any mode of expression and joint attention to materials and activities. But, so those are sort of the level of kids that this presentation is going to focus on. Those foundational node examples Emily Thatcher put out for this population. For this population of kids, we're going to be talking about those kids who are starting to express interest in other people and objects, and then those kids that are attending to stimuli. So these are those children when we've talked in previous sessions that we're trying to get them to move away from their bodies, out of their mouths a little bit more, using their hands and their bodies to interact and explore with objects. I think I've shown this pyramid before in this presentation series, but I think it's important for us to kind of remember and think about where our kids are and what all kids are learning, how they're moving up that continuum of learning. And this is from Millie Smith's SAM guidebook. The first thing our kids learn about is their own body. Then once they learn a little bit about their own bodies, then they start coming out a little bit more and they start learning about people, objects, and actions touching their body. Now that should, when we talked about that DLM cognitive, expanded taxonomy of cognitive processes, that should look familiar. Then that next thing that they're going to do is they move up to people, objects, actions, and places beyond the body. And today, for most of this presentation, we're going to talk a lot about objects touching the body and our kids interacting with objects, using their body to interact with objects. An important thing for us to all remember is that the active learning theory by Piaget, learning involves discovery through the manipulation of objects and interaction with people, places, and things. And what we have to remember for our kids, do they have to interact and manipulate objects? How many opportunities do they have to meaningfully interact with objects and manipulate them? Because that's one of the ways they learn how to, one of the very important ways that they learn how to use their bodies. And then when they're interacting with those objects, how are we helping them interact more sophisticatedly with those objects? And we're going to talk about that today. Piaget's stages of development, you know, this is that sensory motor, then that pre-operational, concrete, and formal operational. Sensory motor, which is kind of where a lot of our kids are, they're moving from that sensory motor into that pre-operational stage. They're using sucking, grasping, and gross body. When they build schemes, what that's doing is that's making sense of their environment. They're helping to organize their world, and that's absolutely critical in learning. We have to be able to make sense of little pieces of information and know how they relate to each other in order to build that whole, in order to build and expand upon the things that we're learning about. Those kids are gaining object permanence, and they're thinking with their senses more. So they're using their senses to learn about their environment. They're using their sense of touch, they're using their sense of vision, they're using their sense of hearing in whatever capacity they can to learn about their environment. They begin to solve problems by playing with toys and using everyday tools, such as spoons, such as a spoon, to learn to feed themselves. And then they move up to that pre-operational stage. In that pre-operational stage, they pick on concrete representations, and they move into symbolic representations, such as pictures and language. That's up the continuum. Building symbolic representation. Symbolic representation would also be things like literacy, concepts in literacy in math. Symbols are, literacy is a symbol system that conveys meaning across time and space. And we talked about that in our session on experience books and boxes. In that pre-operational stage, also they're using their immediate surroundings as a frame of reference. I know when I'm here, I do this whole building schemes things. There's some things here that tell me what I'm going to do now. It's effortless for us because all of our sensory systems are intact, but for our kids, sometimes that's a challenge. Accelerated language development starts to language starts to develop and accelerate, and they start to internalize and think about different events. And then judgments are made based upon how things look. There are 3 types of learning. Direct learning, which is hands-on contact and personal experience. For example, touching a rock and learning it's a rock. Secondary learning, similar to today's lecture, where you're learning information based upon what someone else is saying. And then incidental learning, and a lot of learning for many kids with intact sensory systems comes incidentally. They know how to stand in line. They know how to eat because they have all kinds of access to seeing other people eat. They have access to seeing other kids stand in line. They have access to seeing other kids sit at circle. They have access to seeing other kids or people use functional objects like forks, like spoons, like eating utensils, like napkins. They have all kinds of access. For our kids who are multiply impaired and do not have intact vision and or hearing, their ability to learn incidentally is compromised greatly. So we have to think about direct learning for those kids. So then when we're talking about things like active learning and Piaget's stages of cognitive development, then how are we providing those things for our kids? Well, one of those ways that we're providing that immediate kind of access to learn by doing is through active learning. Active learning is developed by Lily Nielsen, and it's an approach to working with children who are multiply and visually impaired, including deafblindness. This approach is based upon the notion, similar to Piaget, that almost all children learn exclusively by doing until the developmental age of about 3. Active learning offers strategies to advance learning for children who are visually and multiply impaired, the ability to access information in carefully constructed environments that encourage children to actively learn and explore by doing. I can't overstate enough the fact that our kids do not have access to information. Okay? If you have a child who can't see things or has a visual impairment, if you have a child who can't hear things well or has an auditory impairment, their ability to access information and learn from that information is greatly compromised. So then what we try to do is, first of all, get the best handle we can on what they can see and hear, which can often be a challenge. And then we employ other sensory systems like touch to help support learning. So active learning is going to employ more of that sense of touch. In active learning, the actions of examining and experimenting with objects using their body is the foundation for the development in cognitive, motor, problem solving, and eventually social skills. Dr. Nielsen believes our role in helping children learn is to create environments that build on the skills the child already has to encourage him to use his body and mind for higher level tasks. Why do students benefit from active learning? Many kids fail to develop those foundational concepts, you know, that whole scheme. They fail to build those schemes, those systems of organization that help them learn. They fail to develop those because they can't interact independently with their environment and use their bodies effectively. Or they're not aware that the world exists beyond their body. Their world may only extend as far as their hands, feet, or mouth can access. And there's a lot of things that our kids have immediate access to in their bodies to create stimulation. And so that's another reason why we got to get their hands out. We got to get them some objects and some environments, some things they can use their hands and their bodies to interact with so that they're not coming back in to their bodies to create the stimulation that the brain naturally seeks. Also, stressful life events may severely impair cognitive and emotional development. I know I've talked about this a lot. I know we're going to hear a lot more about it. Our kids endure a huge amounts of stress from having very little control over their environment, over their lives, over what's happening to them, and sometimes very little understanding of what's going to happen to them. We think, or sometimes we'll say, oh, he knows what's going to happen. But just because we infer that, you know, project that onto them, doesn't necessarily mean they understand what's happening. And then they have very little control and say over what's happening to them because everyone else is manipulating their bodies or moving them from task to task to task. And sometimes, again, they have very little control over that. And that's a lot of stress. That's a lot of stress. So once you guys get the handouts, there's a few things I'm going to talk about, you know, today, this active learning. This is a days-long presentation, and I'm trying to pull it into about an hour. And so what I did was try to give you some really good resources that you could go to after the presentation was over. And one of the my favorite resources that will be available to you guys today after the session is the 5 phases of educational treatment used in active learning based upon excerpts from Are You Blind by Dr. Lily Nielsen. And it's an article that goes through, let's see, I think there's 5 phases. 5 phases, yep. The 5 phases of learning that are part of active learning. So, and what I like about it is exactly what's up on this slide. Is within each level, they talk about what children at this level do. They discuss the role of the adult. What should adults do and what should they not do? Because there's some things we shouldn't be doing that we're doing. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. And then they also talk about points to be emphasized at that level. So nice article. I wish I could go into it a little bit more. Nice article. I really encourage you guys to read through that and think about where your student is functioning with their hands and with their bodies within those different levels. And then think about what your role is and what things need to be emphasized or taught to that child within that different phase. So then the next article that I sent to you guys is called Active Learning and the Exploration of Real Objects. In Lily Nielsen's Active Learning equipment, she has several different kinds of environments. And I'm going to show you in these next few slides, I'm going to show you some of those environments, and then we're going to talk about, and then I'm going to show you some examples, and I'm going to talk about a few things for you to be considering within each of those environments. So the first example is of a little room, and one on the left is, and actually on the right is a little room for a high school age student that is, I think they're using it in Michigan or Minnesota right now. I haven't seen very many of them, the larger ones in Iowa. Also at Iowa Braille right now, we just bought several, they're called Sight of Sense rooms. We just bought several, and I am now logging them in and getting ready for them to be shipped out to for trial periods to different kids and different teams. But essentially what the little room does is you can put children in these little rooms, and you and their hands are supposed to have access, their hands and their bodies are supposed to be very close to touching some of these objects. And so what they start to learn is when I'm in this environment and my body touches something, something happens. So if you guys can see that tambourine, there's kind of an orange tambourine in that little room on the left-hand side. If that student touches that tambourine, something's going to happen. So essentially, this is another way of kind of teaching cause and effect with different parts of their body. These kids and these are the kids that would be at some of the very earliest stages of motor development, frequently rooms that we use with very young children. And with all of these different educational environments, what you're going to frequently see too, like look on that, for sure, that example of the older student in the high school environment, is things these kids can come in contact with in their natural environment. So you'll see those steel sort of measuring spoons there, and then that egg scrambler or whatever it's called there, and then there's a cup and some spoons or wooden spoons in a bowl. Those are things that they're going to be hopefully be coming in contact with within some of their daily routines, and we need to give them exposure to those objects beyond just, this is lunchtime, I'm going to serve you from this spoon and I'm going to get the food out of this bowl. They should have some kind of access to those objects so that they have the opportunity to learn about those objects out of context. The next piece of equipment is called a scratching board, and as you can see on that left-hand side there, the TVI is using a hand-under-hand technique with an older student. Sometimes what I'll see people do is put these scratching boards in front of kids and then not give them any tactile modeling strategies, so then the child doesn't even know that it's necessarily there, and they're not sure how maybe they're supposed to be objects. So remember I think it was our December session, I talked a lot about tactile strategies and relationships. At some points during some of these active learning activities, you're going to have to do some tactile modeling, because our kids, once again, remember, they can't see how other people might be interacting with these objects. So we got to teach them. And the way we're going to teach them is we're going to use some hand-under-hand techniques and some tactile modeling. And the thing about the scratching boards that I kind of want you to remember is try to use a variety of different textures. And also you'll see the one on the bottom on the right-hand, right-hand side, it's got shiny, a lot of shiny properties. For our kids with CVI, that's real important. Shiny helps them direct their visual attention. Shiny's a very good thing. Mylar paper, these DVDs, see all that metal on there, that's a very good thing to help develop their visual access and to draw their visual attention to it. And then you can see up in that top right-hand corner, those are just kind of mops and different cleaning brushes, but you know, the thing we got to remember is touch. How does it feel tactily? And it doesn't always have to be soft and perfect and pretty. It can be hard, it can be rough. Some of our kids like that. It can be cool, it can be metal. We got to have a variety of different textures for them to touch and interact with. So the scratching board, a lot of what they're doing is scratching and or using their hands to manipulate those different pieces of equipment. Here's and we're going to talk a little bit too in vests in a minute here, because we have some kids that are still very, that aren't as comfortable with going beyond their bodies. So we're going to talk about the vest thing in a second. This next one is an example of a tipping board. If you'll look at the ones on the bottom, on the left side of the bottom there are a lot of kitchen objects suspended on those tipping boards that are there. And in that classroom, kids in walkers or wheelchairs are able to, or who are mobile, are able to get around and access some of those real kitchen objects. Just remember that, you know, again, these aren't the things that we think are, you know, are plastic and look pretty. These are the things that they're coming in contact with, and we want them to come in contact with in various environments. I saw one, and I don't know if I have it in this, I don't think I have it in this presentation, one in the bathroom with brushes and toothbrushes, so that our kids can start to feel those things out of context and get an image in their mind, build a tactile image in their mind of what all the properties of what a brush feels like and what a toothbrush feels like. They need time to explore those things. We can take a glance at these things and we know all kinds of things about it. It only takes us a second. For our kids, we gotta give them time to touch it and feel it, the whole thing out of context and then in context as well. On that top right-hand side is just those, I don't know, rollers for different tables and things, and they textured it with puppy paint, and then affixed it to the board with, I don't know, some kind of string or something. I have used zip ties in the past because they're very cheap and they're fast and they're not going to come undone. And so, you know, again, when you're looking at the wheels up there, then we might use tactile strategies to help show this child how the wheels roll. And that's a fun thing for a lot of kids. So we're going to teach them how to do that. So now we've moved from the scratching board, scratching things and moving our hands over things, to doing something with these objects. Up in that upper left-hand corner, what you can kind of see there is those are beads and necklaces, and then jingle bells. So with the beads and necklaces, what we're hoping is they're going to start to get them intertwined with their hands and their fingers. So now we're not just touching, they're using their hands to pull and explore on those objects. This is the example of the vest. And so the vest we can use for some of those kids that I would describe as their hands are still pretty close to their bodies and they're not real willing to go out very far beyond the bodies. So then what we can do is we can use a vest and sew some things on it that might be tactily something the child likes to touch, or they might like to interact with. We can put those things on there so that they can begin to use their hands to explore those objects. And on this right-hand side, that is actually a belt. That red thing is actually a belt, and that's something they put around an older student, that belt there, because she would keep her hands, she kept her hands real close, and she liked to do things with her hands when she was out in different environments, and so then they put some of those things on there. Oh, I don't know if she's an older student or not, because I see that child's toy on there. But I know I have another example of a belt. It was a very, well, anyway. The belts are things that you can use to put different materials on so that they have something to do with their hands that's close to their bodies. The kids using some of those scratching boards and those position boards, they're a little bit more willing to go beyond their bodies. These kids with the vests and the belts and things that are real close to them, they're not quite as willing to go very far beyond their body. The next environment that Lily talks about in that article is called resonance boards. And resonance boards, if you look at the bottom of these pictures, you'll see a bit of a board. It's a board that's built up about an inch off the floor. Resonance boards are more for, well, what they do is they create a sound. When things drop on them or fall on them or they're playing with something, there's a very definite sound that's created. And so basically it's just another sensory input about objects that children can get from interacting with objects close to that resonance board. And if I'm almost positive this is a high school classroom. In this classroom, you'll see on that left side in the left picture, there's rolling pins and mixing bowls and cupcake tins and all kinds of things. And these are activities that these are tools that sometimes these kids do different activities, cooking activities and things with. And, and then on the right-hand side, there are a few more examples of different interesting objects. I see some strainers and spoons and things on that resonance board. But it's a place where these kids can go to interact with objects. Here are a few more examples that I just kind of, people always find real interesting. On that top left-hand side, those are door stops, and I think they're cocked. They might be bolted on, I'm not sure, but I thought they were cocked onto a cookie tin. And so what the kids are getting from that, again, is when we move beyond the scratching board into more hand use, hopefully, what the kids are getting from that is, they touch those door stops and they hear that big loud twang, and it's magnified on the cookie tin. So it's just a way they begin to interact with their environment with objects that they're very interested in. Then on that right-hand side there, again, I'm pretty sure those are door stops, and they just ordered some pencil toppers, I think it was from the dollar store, and used caulk to put them on top of those door stops there. And so then the kids could move their arms and their hands back and forth on top of that, on top of those door stops. And then on that bottom left-hand side, the reason that's a scratching board, and the reason I wanted to kind of show you that is it's a scratching board that's almost moving up, that's doing two really cool things. One is it's using a lot of shiny stuff. So you can see some of those tassels with mylar ribbon just below it, and then some kind of a mylar bow up in that right-hand side there. So they're using a lot of shiny stuff there, and then they have lots of different textures. You see the sandpaper on that upper left-hand corner there, and then there's some kind of a rough star-shaped. It's you can't see it very well. It's opaque, but a rough star-shaped grid thing, that's on there too. So what we have to remember to think about too is a variety of textures, and it doesn't have to be visually appealing. It can be tactily appealing. We want these kids to touch with their hands. So wide variety of different types of textures. And let me go back to something. When I said it doesn't need to be visually appealing, what I mean is we want everything to be pretty and perfect, and it doesn't have to look pretty and it doesn't have to look perfect. The visual piece, they are addressing the visual piece on that board because they have the mylar stuff there, and it's a white background, and then there's some black pieces on the front of it too. So there's good contrast there too. So just a few things to think about. I think I have some more examples. A few more examples in this next slide here. So up in the top right-hand corner, I've seen a lot of teams do the PVC pipe types and suspend different types of toys or beads on trays or on tables or things like that. The mylar beads are nice for two reasons: because of that shininess, and then also because of the because they do something when you touch it. So on the scratch boards, things don't necessarily do something, but on this on the PVC pipe one, they do. And the other thing I'd say about that is and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but for some kids, that PVC pipe environment with all the Mardi Gras beads might be too much. You might only want to do maybe 2 things on there, especially for our kids that are sometimes at those earliest stages in phase 1 of cortical visual impairment. And the background too, I might be real tempted to put a black background there so that would increase their ability to visually access that information. On that bottom left-hand side, all those is pegboard. And again, pegboard and a lot of zip ties, pegboard and zip ties. And then they just put things that are natural. That was kind of a larger sensory room. So they put objects in there that might be in a sensory room or sometimes might be in a gymnasium or music room. I don't know, maybe specials, I don't know. In the middle there, that white thing that's hanging down is called a HOPS address. And so what they do with the HOPS address is the child is put in that, and Lily is from Denmark. So that's why maybe the HOPS address thing, I don't know, that's how it translates, So anyway, so what the HOPS address is for is the child is suspended in that piece of equipment, in that HOPS address. The shoes are off, and then on the floor, they have the ability to tactily explore those different things on the floor. And then on the right-hand side, that's called, I think that's the springboard. It's either the springboard or the SF board. It might be the SF board, and they can just put their feet on there and experiment with using their legs a little bit. And then the blue picture, all that's in the blue picture is, some of you that have little bitty kids, little bitty babies will recognize, those are lids to Gerber, those little plastic Gerber baby food containers. And they put those there with some beads to attract a little bit of attention with an uncluttered background. A little example of what we're trying to get our kids to do with these different pieces of equipment. We're trying to get them to come away from their bodies, away from manipulating their bodies, putting their hands in their giving them some objects to interact with their hands that they enjoy using. So you saw him with some of the metal stuff. You saw him with some of the beads at the bottom of his walker there. What I would say about all of these things, you guys, is it's not rocket science. You got to think about what you're trying to accomplish with your kids. The big picture is, I want him to interact with his environment so that he is learning how to use his body. So then what you do is you go out and you find things that you think he's going to interact with. And we're going to talk about observing our kids while they're using some of those things too. Okay, let me go on to the next slide. The next article in your handout will be handout number is on DENS. And DENS are another educational environment that Millie talks about to overcome things like tactile passivity. Tactile passivity is sometimes when they're not touching anything. They don't want to touch anything. So a little room is something you can do to help support that. All of these, in my opinion, all of those other pieces of equipment that we just viewed can help support that. And then also a den. And I also have to say, guys, I use the den in my own classroom, and I found for a number of my kids, it was a very helpful place for them to go at times when things got a little overstimulating in my classroom, or when kids got a little overstimulated. It was a nice place for them to be able to retreat into. Now, I had to make some rules, just like we do with all tools that that our kids use. You know, we don't just give pencils to kids and tell them they can't throw them or stab other kids with them or whatever. We had to make some rules about those educational environments. You can't be in there all day long. There's certain things you can't do there that you have to do in the bathroom, you know, things like that. So you always have to use a little common sense with these things. So a den is a defined space filled with interesting stuff. Again, think about what they want to touch. Think about what they might want to look at. Think about what they might want to listen to. to enhance cognitive, tactile, and tactile development through object exploration. Going back to all that Piaget stuff, and also what Millie Smith says, and the DLM cognitive process of learning, we're massaging those kids up that continuum. These three things are examples of DENs. The one in the top left-hand corner we had at Iowa Braille School, and it has that pegboard on it. And again, we would use zip ties. I don't know why I can't remember that word today. We would use zip ties to tie different things at different places in that DEN, and the frequency with which we would change materials out, or the types of materials that we would use in there, would depend upon the learners that we would have in there. I had a group of kids that I had one of those unbreakable mirrors, you know, that you can order from, I don't know, one of the, I don't know, you can order, I know there's all kinds of specialty ordering equipment places that you can get it from, and that was wildly popular in one of my DENs, a mirror. And then in this, the other ones that I've seen people use, these were both actually at Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, is tents, you know, where you can just put different things in there for the kids to interact with. And again, you know, I'm not saying, you guys, you're just going to let your kids go in there and do whatever they want. There have to be parameters. There's parameters in everything that they do. You know, you are the ones that are helping to support their understanding of what's acceptable in here and what's not. But these are good environments for our kids to go into and interact potentially with objects and or retreat when they feel very overwhelmed, because sometimes our kids do feel very overwhelmed. And I will tell you too, in my classroom, before I got a little room, I did have a big box in there for a while that was very popular. I had younger kids, but that was one of the things at that time, but that was one of the things that kind of illustrated to me how a DEN could potentially be a very useful tool in my classroom. So those are, you know, that is the short list, down and dirty, about as quick as I can go through some elements that Lily describes in the active learning, through active learning materials. And then also remember, I talked about a little bit earlier, read that phases article, because the phases article is going to help you determine what types of material you want in those learning environments. The other article that I sent you all is called The Introduction to Dr. Nielsen's Active Learning. And what that kind of, this slide is sort of a summary of that article, and it's kind of a brief article too, actually. But basically what that says, and I know I've kind of tried to drive this home in previous presentations, but what that says is make sure you're watching the kid. Don't just put them in these environments and then walk away. Don't just put a scratching board in front of them and then walk away. You have got to watch them. You've got to watch them, because remember how we talked about being an impeccable observer, and I know I probably have this in other slides, but I'm going to start talking about it now. Because you want to see, what are they interacting with? What are they touching? What are they avoiding? How far are their hands moving away from their bodies to get to that thing that they really like? Are they using the left side more than the right side? Is there something, if we want them to get to use that right side, is there something that they touch and access with their left hand that we can put on that right side to get them to move a little bit more? Then the other thing you're going to do is you want to provide the child with activities and objects similar to those he or she enjoys. So again, while you're watching the child, you're going to think, oh, he likes that Mylar thing. Where else can we find some Mylar things? And how can we find them in different forms? And then if you go back and you read that phases article, then how can you massage them up that cognitive, motor scale? And that's another place, I'll tell you what, you guys, I'd be calling my OT in and saying, watch how she uses her hands. How else can I encourage her to use her hands? And ask your TVI, look at how she's looking at this. Look at how she's looking at that piece of light. Watch how she's touching this or interacting with that. And then give the child opportunities to practice and or compare. And I'll tell you what, When we talk about comparing objects, that to me sounds like math and some of that stuff that's on alternate assessment now. I know I probably got a bunch of people rolling their eyes right now, but I just went through a long meeting yesterday and just thought I'd bring that up. So we got to give the child opportunities to practice using their hands, using their feet, using whatever part of their body that they want to get these objects to move, to interact with those objects. And again, and I talked about this a little bit before, but don't just, sometimes when you're doing those scratching boards or the tipping boards, don't just put those things in front of them and expect that the child is going to learn all on their own how to use this thing. Use a little bit of that hand under hand, those tactile strategies that we talked about, to teach them, to show them how you're using your hands to interact with these different objects and what they can do with those objects. Provide a few materials and activities that are a slightly higher developmental level to provide a challenge. We talked about in other sessions too. And once again, we're not just putting these things in front of the kids and they're using the same scratching board the first day of school as they use on the last day of school. We are observing them and we are moving up the continuum. This is, that is part of that, having high expectations for our kids. We're not doing the same thing over and over again. We're moving them up that continuum. Other important considerations. This is another thing, and we've talked a little bit about this in other sessions. Don't interrupt the child by talking when the child is actively engaged in playing. So sometimes we got to know the difference between instructional language and chatter. And for some of our kids that might have processing challenges in processing lots of information, auditory, visual, tactile. When we start talking, we keep them away from focusing on that tactile piece and learning about touch and how they're using their bodies. So I'm going to give you an example. When you have those kids that have cerebral palsy, and I'll frequently hear people say, "Oh, she's so nosy. Every time somebody comes in the door, she raises her head up and she looks over there." Well, some of that has to do with the fact that our kids have a real big challenge sorting out where to direct their attention, because when one other thing comes in, then all of a sudden, boom, they're gone from the tactile exploration. Now they're over here at auditory because somebody has come in the room, and that's how their brain works. I hope that kind of made sense. Another important consideration is slow down when you're interacting with the child. We move very quickly. And for some of our kids, that whole process of bringing information in and then acting upon it is a big challenge. And we talked about that in that, I know in that tactile strategies session. We've got to slow down. We're too eager to rush in and take control of our kids' bodies and do things for them without giving them a chance to do whatever thing that they can to participate within that activity. And then let the child have control of his or her hands. We're not doing that hand over hand thing. They've got to have control of their hands. If they want to pull away and come back, they're going to pull away and come back. One of the techniques that Lily talks about is the offering technique. That is, again, you're using hand under hand technique when offering, modeling, or guiding. Minimize taking control of the hands, of the child's hands. And when you do take control of his or her hands, I didn't mention this before, or body, give advance notice that you're about to do so with an auditory or touch cues. And remember, we talked about
Are the rest of you hearing her okay, or is it just
that you guys will get in your handout? When they are. Am I back, Jess?
Yeah, I think so. Now I could hear you better. I don't know if it's my connection or if it's yours, but you're breaking up a little bit.
Okay. So with the little room forms in your handouts, you'll have two data collection forms. And again, we're not just putting these things in front of the kids. We're not just letting them go into these little rooms, into these dens, into these sensory environments without some data. We're going to take some data on how they use their hands, maybe how far away they went their bodies, what were the tactile properties of the things they do. Oh, and in this form too, you can see, did they use their vision? Did they look at it, or did they just start batting at it? Because that's important for us to know too. The other data collection sheet goes more into different actions and concepts, and then also take some data on their spatial awareness, how they find things in space, how they locate things in space, and positioning, because positioning can be real critical too. And you know, with some of this active learning stuff, you guys, I would be talking real closely to your PT and your OT, because if our kids, and you guys know this because you've been working with these kids for a while, if our kids' bodies are not in a position that communicates to them that they're going to be doing something, if they're not comfortable, then they're not going to be willing to do something, okay? I hope that kind of made sense. Your body should be in some kind of a position, in terms of PT, some kind of a position that allows you to explore and learn with your hands during this active learning process. And also what I'd be talking to my OT and having her watch or observe, or send her some private YouTube videos, and you can say, watch her do this, look at her use her hands, is there something else? Your team, I said this in previous sessions, you know, working, I'd love to see somebody do some kind of doctoral research on effective programming for these kids that are multiply impaired, because to me, working together as a team is absolutely critical. Our kids are real challenging in a lot of different areas, and having that support from PT, OT, speech, your teacher of the visually impaired, your teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing, about how our kids are accessing information and learning is absolutely critical. Oh my gosh, I'm probably gonna, I'm driving this home for sure. Again, interacting with the hands and the body, use that tactile strategies, watch the child's hands, and learn how to read how he or she uses them. Just, for our kids that are visually impaired, and, for many of us, for our kids that are just multisensorily impaired, their hands are, you can think of them as initiators of topics, things they want to talk about. They're looking at this with their hands because they're interested in it. And particularly think about it for those kids who do not yet use words or language. Pacing and watching. Boy, I think I put too many slides in here about watching. Pacing, response times are often very delayed for our kids. And so if we don't give them enough time to respond, they may stop trying to respond, or they may respond in ways that are very often interpreted as inappropriate. So if we don't wait, they basically have two choices. Either they submit to whatever you're asking them to do, or they resist. We gotta wait. Allow them to do whatever they can. Slow it way down. Pacing is critical. Be impeccable observers. We talked about this. Consider videotaping and then reflecting about the interaction, and follow the child's lead. Watch them. And I know, I was one of those people. I was moving real fast. I had to get my kids all caught up, and I had to learn to be very quiet, and I had to learn to keep my hands off of those kids more than I was initially comfortable with. It's important always to remember for our kids, instead of effortlessly receiving that flow of information that we all do, we get so much information, we receiving that. Our kids with impaired sensory systems have to work real hard to, first of all, attend, and then to gather information, then interpret it and synthesize that information, and then bring it into some kind of a scheme, like we talked about earlier, that makes it meaningful and that I can relate it to other topics. And that's part of, to me, that would be part of an important part of comprehension and reading comprehension when we talk about literacy. This is important to think about too, the right media. And by media, I mean those are the things your kids are going to be touching during the active learning activities. Remember when we first started and we had that Millie's pyramid in front of us, this is where the learning media hierarchy is. First I learn about my body, then I learn about another's body and objects touching my body, and then objects beyond my body. And then we always have to think about how the brain sorts information, and specifically the limbic system. It sorts things into, I like things, I'm going to attend to this. I don't like this, I'm not going to attend to this. And that curiosity window, that I like this, and through that curiosity window, avoiding those extended states. And by extended states, I mean two things. We talked about this in the routines session. By extended states, I mean either they're so agitated they can't attend, or they're so sleepy and drowsy they can't attend. That's why we need that limbic sorting system, and we need to find those things that our kids like, because it helps our kids to avoid the extended states. Less sleeping, less agitation, because I like this thing that I'm going to be interacting with. These are things that I was just literally threw in here about an hour ago about some of the challenging things that we sometimes might see. Sometimes I see teachers, when they're talking about kids actively exploring things, they say, my kid throws things all the time. I can't keep giving him things because he throws things. Well, the two things are about throwing, especially for a child with a visual impairment, is they can't see that objects are coming from somewhere and going to someplace. So when they throw something, they think, well, this is kind of where it came from. So we have to start teaching our kids, things come from a place and they go to a place. And what I've seen a couple of teens do is, it comes from this basket when I start with it, and it goes to this basket when I'm finished with it. And also what I would say for visually impaired kids, sometimes throwing is a very natural state of learning how to use their hands. So then we structure an activity. I saw a teacher in Iowa School for the Deaf do a really good job of structuring throwing. She gave this kid a big box of balls and put him in, it was a more confined sort of learning space, like there were dividers on the left and right side of him. And he threw all those balls that were in that, whatever it was, and there were koosh balls and all different kinds of balls that he could throw. And when he was finished, when the box was empty, throwing was finished. And so throwing had a very structured time to it. The other thing,
about 3 minutes left, it looks like.
Thank you. The other thing that I would say in terms of mouthing is, if our kids are mouthing, we got to think about what do they have access to with their hands to move beyond their bodies. Biting and scratching, again, two things. What opportunities do they have to use their hands and learn how to use them appropriately? Touching them, because that's how they're learning to use their hands. And what are the quality of relationships that they have? When people are around them, what are the quality of those relationships, and how are they learning about interacting with other people? Then self-injurious behaviors. When I think of self-injurious behaviors, it's about control, relationships, and meaningful activities. Sorry, you guys, I got to push through this real fast. The last couple of slides here, again, I've said this, I will keep saying this, building a relationship based upon trust is the most important thing that you can do for your children. If I don't like you, I don't want to learn anything from you. So you've got to build that relationship. I'm not going to want to go beyond my body and get things from you if I don't like you and you keep doing things to me that I don't understand. The essence of our work with these children is helping them to move beyond their world into a shared world with us. These are some places where you guys can go for more information. What I would say is two things. Oh, well, let me move on to the next slides here. This is another really cool place to go to, that Hold Everything. And again, you guys can click on the link and it just generates more ideas for y'all. A closing note about Lily Nielsen and active learning. You know, she would string me up, you guys, knowing that I did a presentation on her work in an hour. These are things that she takes days to do. She has passionately advocates to maintain the quality and integrity of her work. So sometimes you'll see things, instead of called active learning, it might say space and self, or active learning space, or something like that, because she has copyrighted the active learning equipment, and so people don't always use that language. So when you're searching, just be aware of that. Active learning is a highly regarded instructional approach to teach children with multiple and visual impairments and deafblindness. It should be used in conjunction with other instructional strategies, not in isolation. And I think that is it. Whew.